Welcome back. This is our final lecture in our series, and we're talking about the civil rights movement of the 1950s to 1960s, and we'll get into modern America. Let's take a look. All right. So one of the watershed moments of the civil rights movement is the Supreme Court decision to desegregate schools. The Brown versus Board of Education decision overturns Plessy versus Ferguson, says separate is putatively unequal, and schools must desegregate. This included a case right here in Virginia. All right, responses to Brown v. Board varied. Many southern states are going to dig in their heels and resist desegregation. This is Little Rock, Arkansas. Little Rock, Arkansas is where the famous Little Rock Nine, the first 9 African-American students were going to attend school with white students. You can see the response. Look at the anger. All right. And you can see she is just walking into the school. And all of these people that you see around her are there to yell at her, to jeer. They throw things. They spit, right? The governor of Arkansas actually sends in the National Guard and says that they're going to refuse to desegregate. He tries to disobey the federal government. Think back to like the nullification crisis with Jackson. Think back to the Civil War in South Carolina. They're trying the same thing. We've already proven that you can't do it, right? So the federal government and President Eisenhower sends in, you see this guy's patch right here? That's a Screaming Eagle. The 101st Airborne Division, paratroopers. Now, they didn't parachute in, but they're still paratroopers, okay? Paratroopers are sent to enforce school desegregation. So these young ladies and these young men had 101st Airborne paratroopers escort them into the school. They would escort them around the school. Bad things happened to them. One young lady said she went into the bathroom and kids did stuff to her. But this is what it took to force school desegregation. Right here in Virginia, the same thing happened. More on that later. Key fighters, key warriors of the civil rights movement. One of the biggest names of the legal arm of the civil rights movement is Thurgood Marshall. He's part of the NAACP. Remember that organization? We talked about it. Legal Defense Team, right? He one of his most famous cases is the Brown v. Board case. He argues in the Supreme Court for desegregation, and not just schools, but all public facilities. He goes on to become the first African-American Supreme Court justice. All right. Oliver Hill, same thing. Famous case, Brown v. Board. He was born right here in Virginia. He was born in Richmond and became part of the NAACP legal defense team, fighting those key battles in the courts to strike down Jim Crow. All right. Massive resistance is what happened here in Virginia. Let me see if I can move this stuff around so you guys can actually see it. So in Virginia, this guy right here, Harry Flood Byrd, who was governor, now he's a Virginia senator, he was a hardcore pro-segregationist. He didn't want schools to desegregate. He didn't want black children and white children going to school together. He's a pretty bad guy, right? So his solution, what do you think his solution is to fight desegregation? He says, we'll just close the schools. So we're just going to shut down the schools and then establish private academies. So basically, you got to have money. If you are a black student, if you are a low-income white student, you're out of luck, thanks to Harry Flood Byrd and the racist ideology he espoused. Unfortunately, Virginia becomes the spearhead of massive resistance against desegregation. Eventually, the schools reopen and are forced to integrate. But think about it. These kids, they had to fight and protest. They had to go without school. They had to get assaulted and beaten up and have all sorts of bad things happen to them just so that you and I could be together in the classroom day to day. So the next time you're at school and you're like, man, I really don't want to be here, remember that people had to fight and some people had to die just so that we could be in the classroom together doing what we kind of take for granted. Well, maybe we don't take it for granted so much after the pandemic, but you get the idea. White flight is also a problem. Basically, white people start to leave areas where black people live. So they start to leave the cities and move out of the cities and move to neighborhoods that don't allow African Americans. So essentially, housing discrimination it continues to be a thing, but was rampant. And so real estate companies would not sell houses to black people. So all the white people had to do was move, and that created something called de facto segregation. So de jure segregation is legal segregation. I'll write de jure up here. This was struck down by Brown v. Board. But by moving, they created economic segregation. Now I'll just live in a neighborhood away from black people, and that's de facto segregation, economic segregation. Guys, this is still a problem today. And I know, like, you can go to school and you can see that we have students of different races and ethnicities, but if you go around the country, what you find are predominantly white schools and predominantly black schools. Our society is more segregated today than it was in the 1980s. And that's not good. You look around and you look at what happened to George Floyd. You look at the 20 million people that participated in the Black Lives Matter marches and all of these conversations that are being had about race. A big part of the problem is we live in a segregated society. How can we understand and appreciate each other's cultural differences if we don't even go to school together, if we don't even make friends with and have neighbors that look different and have different cultures than us? So this continues to be an issue. And if I sound passionate about it, it's because I am. This is something that we need to care about and work together to resolve. Let's continue to look at the civil rights movement. Like I said, the NAACP is going to challenge segregation in the courts. Its legal defense team is going to be essential in the fight against Jim Crow. We are also going to have people who are actually on the ground fighting Jim Crow through nonviolent direct action. Here's one of the most famous. Who is this? You said Rosa Parks. You are correct. Rosa Parks, by refusing to give up her seat on the bus to a white man, ignites the Montgomery bus boycott. African Americans are going to, people make fun of it today. They say cancel culture. Guys, cancel culture is the original way of defeating racism and segregation. By boycotting the buses, they basically brought the economy in Montgomery to a screaming halt. The bus companies were going to go under. African Americans walked, or they ran free cab services for each other, but they refused to ride the buses until Montgomery desegregated, and it worked. Now, it wasn't easy. It was a hard fight, and there was violence. This is Martin Luther King's house. Martin Luther King, a young reverend, 25 years old, this is his start. He becomes the first time he becomes internationally known is during the Montgomery bus boycott. Guess what? They bombed his house. People angry about the boycott in Montgomery bombed his house. His family was inside. Thankfully, they weren't hurt. He stood on the porch of his bombed out house. People were angry. They wanted to retaliate. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, no, we can't resort to violence. That's what they want us to do. So King was this great leader who went on to become, he became kind of one of the most recognized sort of leaders of the civil rights movement. Powerful guy. Here are the Freedom Rides. These are the Freedom Rides. And basically, these are civil rights activists, white and black, who said, we're going to get on these buses and we're going to ride across the South and we're going to test Brown v. Board and desegregation. It was dangerous, guys. They were urged not to do it. They were taking a big risk. And sure enough, they encountered violence. White mobs beat them up. Their buses were burned. They were arrested in large numbers. John Lewis, who died just this year, the very famous civil rights activist, John Lewis, who was a congressman, who marched in Selma. was also arrested during the Freedom Rides. But this brought national attention to the issues that were going on in the Jim Crow South. These folks were brave and they put themselves at risk so that we could have a better society. Okay, this is Birmingham in 1963, the heavily segregated city of Birmingham, Alabama, right? And the plan in Birmingham was to have peaceful marches. So these would be peaceful marches, and the plan was to march and kneel at the courthouse to pray. This is Eugene Bull Connor. He's the director of public safety, basically the sheriff or chief of police, if you will, in Birmingham. His response to these peaceful marches: spray people with fire hose, beat them with clubs, attack them with police dogs, spray them with tear gas. They arrested Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and threw him in the Birmingham jail. He wrote very famous letters. He wrote a series of letters where he said, hey, guess what? The laws are there for a reason, and we should respect the laws, but some laws are unjust. And Martin Luther King famously said, every citizen has a responsibility, if a law is wrong, if it is unjust, to break that law, to fight back against that injustice, right? What happened in Birmingham was seen around the world. We're in the middle of, look, it's 1963, we're in the middle of the Cold War, and the Soviets said this is shameful. Americans claim to represent freedom and democracy, but look how they're treating African Americans in their cities. That's not freedom, that's not democracy. Kennedy had to act. They passed legislation, civil rights legislation, and Kennedy gave a very famous speech supporting the efforts in Birmingham and calling on Americans to think about what was going on in Birmingham and think about the morality of it. Right, and so the federal government supported the fight against Jim Crow. We also have, let me move my photos and things around here. We also have the 1963 March on Washington. This is planned and executed by A. Philip Randolph, and the headlining event of the March on Washington was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. Look at all those people. Look at that crowd, right? Many people. Talk to your grandparents and your older aunts and uncles, the people in your community. A lot of folks here in Virginia went to this and saw King speak. This march helped influence public opinion to support civil rights legislation and demonstrated the power of nonviolent mass protest. We have seen larger protests than this. You and I are lucky enough to be alive in a time where the Black Lives Matter protests are, at this point, as of me giving it, so this is July of 2020, as of making this recording, over 20 million Americans have marched in peaceful protests for the Black Lives Matter movement. That's larger than this. So we are living through the largest civil rights demonstrations in American history. It's a huge deal, right? But this was a powerful thing. Let's look at King's speech. All right, this is just an excerpt from it. I don't do it justice. Dr. King was an excellent orator, so, but I'll do my best. He said, I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a desert state, sweltering with the heat of injustice and oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. These words resonate across time. Powerful words spoken by a great leader. All right, this is one of the most famous pieces of oratory you'll find. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is passed after this. Prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, gender, or national origin. So this benefits so many Americans. Before this act, it was perfectly legal to discriminate against somebody because they were black, or because they were from Mexico, or because they were a woman. Now that's illegal. All right, you can't segregate public spaces. You can't discriminate in employment based on race or gender or national origin. All right, Lyndon B. Johnson plays an important role in the passage of this legislation. All right, the Voting Rights Act, and I need to move my pictures again. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlaws literacy tests. So they say you can no longer give literacy tests. You have to let people vote. And federal registrars are sent to the South. Their job is to register voters and supervise elections to make sure people in the South don't try to disenfranchise black voters. This resulted in a sharp increase in African American voters. And guys, your vote is power. And when African Americans are able to access what had legally been theirs for a very long time, that gives them a lot more power, a lot more influence. All right, President Johnson also plays an important role in that act. Let's look at some more recent Supreme Court decisions in SOL 15. So our modern Supreme Court, for the first time in just the past few decades, looks a little bit more like the United States. For most of its history, the Supreme Court was white and male. But the United States is obviously not all white and male. So we get the first female Supreme Court justice in the form of Sandra Day O'Connor. You have Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is still on the Supreme Court. You have Clarence Thomas, who is on the Supreme Court currently. Sandra Day O'Connor no longer on the Supreme Court, but you have Sonia Sotomayor, who not only is a woman on the Supreme Court, she's the first Latina woman to serve as a Supreme Court justice. This is important because this high court makes very key decisions, and it needs to reflect the demographic makeup of America, and it kind of is starting to. And so that's a positive thing. All right. The civil rights movement of the 1950s, the 40s, 50s, and 60s provides a model that has given other groups a blueprint as to how to fight for their civil rights. The best current example is marriage equality. The LGBTQ community used the 50s and 60s civil rights movement to also secure civil rights. And so in just the past 10 years or so, we've seen the Supreme Court say that marriage equality is not something that you can take away from the LGBTQ community, so you can get married to somebody regardless of your sexual orientation or gender identity. Also, in a decision just passed down this summer, they said that it is illegal for employers to discriminate against somebody based on their sexual orientation or their gender identity. So the same things that happened during the civil rights movement are happening now for the LGBTQ community. The U.S. Supreme Court protects the individual rights enumerated, listed out in the Constitution of the United States. They do this through judicial review. Remember, I've talked to you guys about judicial review. The Supreme Court looks at the Constitution. It looks at laws or executive actions, and that new law or that executive action must be in line with the Constitution. If it's not, the Constitution always wins, right? And the law is thrown out. Now, we can always change the Constitution. We can amend it and do different things to it. But the power of judicial review continues to be an important tool and makes our Constitution a living document that can adjust as our society changes and evolves. Let's look at changing patterns of immigration. All right. Immigration to the United States has increased, and now we have immigrants coming from diverse countries, especially Latin American countries and Asian countries. People are coming here looking for economic opportunity. We have the best colleges in the world. They're coming here looking for political freedom. Look at this. The most educated group of new immigrants today are people from the Middle East, namely Iran. They have more PhDs per capita than any other group of immigrants. Guys, this right here is to our benefit. The people that choose to immigrate to a foreign country are bold people. Imagine if tomorrow you woke up and you said, I'm going to go to a whole other country, a place I've never been, and I'm going to make a new life there. That's a brave, bold thing. So these folks that are coming over are go-getters, and they're coming here, getting educated, contributing to the economy, and making America successful. All right? Immigration policy continues to be a very major political issue. Strain on government resources is a problem. We're trying to figure out how to deal with immigration. We share a border with Mexico, and so that's been a constant source of strain, and I'll talk about that in a second. But how to manage that border has been a point of contention. We have a labor demand. A lot of Americans like to say that immigrants are taking American jobs, but that's really not the case. There a lot of these folks, especially those that are coming over from Latin America, are filling jobs that Americans aren't willing to do. And so we have this labor demand and this labor supply. We just need to figure out a way to make it work. Border issues are a problem. For a long time, we just looked the other way. Then we decided to strengthen our border. But we still have this labor demand. We still have this relationship of labor demand and a source of supply of labor. So we need to figure out a way to make that work. We need to create a pathway to citizenship. Americans tend to disagree over bilingual education. We don't have an official language in the United States. Most of us speak English. Most people that immigrate here also speak English. But there are some people that think that we shouldn't have to learn another language, that everyone should learn English. That's not really the best attitude. All right, so increasing cultural diversity is a positive thing, but just like when the Southern and Eastern Europeans and East Asians came, just like when the Irish and the Germans came, people get scared of change, of the culture changing. So I told you guys earlier in the course that we have a love-hate relationship with immigration. We like the romantic stories about our ancestors coming here and facing diversity and building a new life. And then we kind of bristle at the immigration going on around us. And we just do well to remember that this nation is an immigration success story. So unless you're Native American, your ancestors came here. Some came here involuntarily via the slave trade. Some came here willingly. Regardless, they built a new life in the face of adversity and built this nation. All right, and so we need to kind of, have a more positive outlook when it comes to immigration, because it's always worked for us. Immigrants contribute disproportionately. Immigrants are 13% of the population, but they're 17% of the labor force, 14% of the economic output, and 15% of small business owners. So they're carrying more than their weight. Don't believe the stereotypes. They contribute to the visual arts, literature, and the labor force, and have accomplished things in science, engineering, and other fields. Let's look at improved communication and technology. In the 60s, Kennedy committed the U.S. to reaching the moon. He said, we choose to go to the moon. The first American to orbit the Earth was this guy right here. Alan Glenn, he orbited the Earth in a small capsule called Friendship 7. The first human to orbit the Earth was Russian. His name was Yuri Gagarin. Remember, we're in a space race with the Russians. We want to beat them to the moon. We did beat them to the moon. In 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first person to walk on the moon. He said famously, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. All right, man walked on the moon in 1969. Sally Ride in the 80s became the first female astronaut. She went up on the space shuttle. Shuttle missions were basically, that was my childhood. When I was a kid, it was the space shuttle. Now space shuttle missions have stopped. The space shuttles have been retired. And now there's all these new rockets that are being developed. It's really exciting. In our lifetime, we'll send people to Mars and maybe even have a manned mission, maybe even a colony on Mars or on the moon. I sure hope so, because that's really exciting. Let's take a look. This is John Glenn. This is Friendship 7. This is what he orbited the Earth in. Take a look at this. This is Neil Armstrong. Back here, this is the lunar lander known as Aquarius. And so they took off on this big Apollo 11 rocket. And then each of these stages separated off after it got into orbit. Then they orbited the moon in this. They landed on the moon in this. They returned to Earth in this. And they re-entered Earth orbit in this capsule right here. Splashed down into the water, inflated these things, and a Navy ship picked them up. Pretty incredible, guys. Space exploration. All right. Space shuttle missions were a big deal when I was a kid. The space shuttle went up. The space shuttle delivered all sorts of things into orbit, like the Hubble Space Telescope and similar space telescopes. These space telescopes allow us to look out into the known universe and find things. And so we're finding all of these rocky planets that are other potential inhabited worlds. So for the first time, we're able to look out into space with these telescopes and see planets that might hold whole civilizations, just like ours. That's crazy to think about. We sent the Mars rover. We've sent numerous from Mars rovers, Sojourner and Truth, to search the planet. The Mars rovers, guess what they found out? There's frozen water on Mars. Guys, if there's frozen water on Mars, we can settle Mars, right? So in our lifetimes, that might become reality. Exciting stuff. Check this guy out. This is Voyager. We sent out 2 Voyager space probes, 1 and 2, and we sent them out. The first Voyager space probe went out in 1977. And just recently, I think in 2012, Voyager 1 became the first probe, the first man-made object to leave our solar system. It crossed out of our solar system. You know what's cool? Back in 2017, even though this thing went into space in 1977, they sent this thing a command and fired its thrusters in 2017. So they believe that Voyager will be able to continue to transmit data back to us until at least 2025, at which time we will lose contact with it and it will fly off into space forever. Pretty cool stuff. All right. Satellites launched into space by rockets and especially by the Space Shuttle program are having a huge impact on our lives today, namely with global positioning satellites. So GPS satellites allow for us to it's a grid over the planet Earth, right? And so that's why your GPS on your phone knows where you are within a very short distance. That allows the military to perform operations and have smart weapons. Driverless cars, which will become a very normal thing in your lifetime and mine, are operated by GPS. So GPS is this wonder technology that is just changing the way we live and work. Mobile devices, cell phones. Guys, when I was your age, I love starting a sentence like that. When I was your age, we had just started to get cell phones. They were flip phones. Nobody was really texting or picture messaging yet. Social media wasn't a thing. Now, the world is more connected than it ever was. Everybody has a mobile device. You can see things going on all around the world in real time. Think of the consequences of that. Think of the civil rights movement that's going on as I record this. It's happening because when these incidents of brutality, when these bad things happen, everybody can see it and everybody cares about it. It's the same thing as like back before the Civil War, when Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin and made people see and experience slavery firsthand, and so they cared about it and they wanted to fix it. Well, guess what? Mobile devices, cell phones are allowing us to communicate and do the same thing. Advances in robotics are changing human society as well. Factories are becoming automated. Some people have been displaced because of this. We've lost jobs, but new jobs are being created. And we're also using robots to explore. All right? Telecommuting. Thanks to improvements in communications technology, not everybody has to travel to work. They can work from home. Telecommuting. Online coursework. Guys, this is a thing that has been normal in college for a long time. Online classes and virtual learning. Colleges have been doing it for a while. When you go off to college, it'll definitely be part of your education. Now, during the pandemic, it's become a cornerstone of education. You might be at home right now listening to this, because of the pandemic. And I may use this recording for years, and you guys might be like, what pandemic? That was years ago. But virtual learning has grown considerably thanks to this improvement in technology. Service industries have replaced industrial processes. So America has a service-based economy. Service industries are things like law enforcement, medicine, legal services. Service industries are basically what our economy is built on. Breakthroughs in medical research have occurred, allowing us to live longer, healthier lives. There have been major breakthroughs in diagnostic imaging, so things like CAT scans, MRIs, that's magnetic resonance imaging, PET scans of the brain, that's positron emission tomography. We can look into the body in ways we never could before and understand our neurological processes, our blood flow, the way our muscles work. We can see them work and understand how our bodies work. And by doing that, we can treat mental illness and physiological illness in ways we never could before. Huge shift. We're outsourcing some work. So we're hiring contractors overseas. We're outsourcing work to other countries. We're offshoring some work. So a lot of our manufacturing is done in China. A lot of manufacturing has been offshore to China. A lot of service work has been outsourced to India, right? Overseas labor is cheaper, which results in cheaper products. Now, some Americans don't like this. The only thing is that it's hard to bring those jobs back because that's going to increase the prices of products and lower the standard of living. So what we really need to do is we need to create new high-tech manufacturing jobs here in the United States and keep them here. But there is some of this offshoring and outsourcing. All right. Something occurs during this time called the Reagan Revolution, and that is where we see conservative Republicans push for tax cuts, increased rights for states, judges limiting their own power, it's judicial restraint, and to sum it up, basically smaller national government, less national government. Remember, I told you guys that modern day Republicans, modern conservatives trace their basically political heritage back to the anti-federalists. Weak national government, more states' rights, except a strong military. They advocate for a strong military. The Reagan Revolution has continued for some time. We see its evidence beyond Reagan's time in office with the election of his vice president, George H.W. Bush, the centrist Democrat, Bill Clinton, and a Republican sweep of elections in state houses in the 90s, and the election of George W. Bush in 2009. All right. So let's take a look at the U.S. government and the economy in modern times. A healthy economy equals full employment, I should say full employment, as in low. You're always going to have unemployed people in the economy, but you want that number of people to be low. You want inflation to be low. That means the dollar is worth more, right? The government can encourage a healthy economy a couple different ways. Remember I talked about the Federal Reserve, how it can raise and lower interest rates, and in doing so, it can increase or decrease the money supply. So the Federal Reserve uses monetary or money policy to control the money supply, the amount of money in circulation, by raising interest rates or lowering interest rates. Remember, it's like a gas pedal or a brake for the economy. By doing this, they control the amount of credit, how much people borrow. And this causes them to speed up or slow down economic growth depending on the decisions that they make. All right, we talked a lot about the Federal Reserve. Now, there's also fiscal or finance policy. Fiscal or finance policy are done by the president and Congress. They determine the tax rates and decide how much the government spends. They also decide how much the government should regulate the economy. Should there be more regulation or less regulation? If you're economically conservative, you want less regulation. If you're economically liberal, you want more government involvement in the economy. Remember, too much is bad, too little is bad. Too much and you stifle growth, too little and you end up with kids working in coal mines. So the right answer is probably somewhere in the middle. And there will always be a debate, a political debate, about how much is too much and how little is too little. And that's the nature of American politics. I really wouldn't say there's a right and wrong, there's just opinion. And the best thing that you can do is just hear both sides of it, decide what seems most appropriate for you and your values, and then vote accordingly. So, a few questions just to get you thinking. Should businesses be allowed to make decisions that increase profit? Should businesses be allowed to pay their workers any wage they want? Should businesses be held responsible if they damage the environment? Right? Remember, there's too many rules prevent growth, too few rules hurt the economy, the people, and the environment, etc. So, like I said, there's always going to be a tug of war with this, and it's really kind of up to you to decide what makes the most sense. All right. In the modern world, the number one sort of defense issue is terrorism. So there are states that we're adversarial with. Great states, Russia and China, we don't get along with very well. But it's unlikely that we're going to go. And knock on wood, God forbid. But it's unlikely that we're going to go to war directly with these nations, because that would be incredibly destructive, and everybody's economy would be hurt greatly. We rely on each other for trade. So we're kind of in this game of sort of influence, vying for influence around the world with big countries like that. But we do have a threat to security from terrorism, all right? And so what we've seen in modern times is a global war on terrorism, all right, as in Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, as in Operation Iraqi Freedom in Iraq. We're operating in Syria, so all of these places. We have diplomatic initiatives where we're negotiating, right, to try to push back against terrorism. There's heightened security at home. An example of that is the Patriot Act passed under the Bush administration, which allows the government to conduct surveillance to fight against terrorism. It does help. However, there is a privacy concern, because we know that organizations like the NSA have spied on Americans when they weren't supposed to, right? So there's a privacy concern with the Patriot Act. We created the Department of Homeland Security, whose part of their job is to identify and deal with terror cells within the United States. All right, this concludes our SOL 15F lecture, or our SOL 15 lecture. Make sure you guys do the discussion board. Make sure you read the narrative and answer the questions, and make sure you fill out those guided notes.